In the winter of 1259, something out of the ordinary caught the eye of Polish farmers in their fields. Mongol scouts, frozen solid atop their horses, stood as grim statues, man and beast alike, their eyes pecked out by ravens. The locals didn't bother burying them. Instead, they turned the macabre scene, Tamazenin, into a marketplace, setting up stalls around the frozen corpses, selling hot soup while using the dead Mongols as ghoulish decorations. Kids amused themselves by pelting them with snowballs. Dogs relieved themselves on them. One particularly entrepreneurial merchant even hung a sign from a frozen Mongol's outstretched arm, advertising fresh bread, not made from human flesh like Mongol food. This wasn't just fear anymore, this was outright contempt. For 2 long decades, Europe had been haunted by nightmares of the Mongols. But now they'd become nothing more than carnival attractions. People remembered the horrors of Lenica, where Mongol warriors filled 9 sacks with the severed ears of Europeans. They remembered the drinking cups crafted from the skulls of children. They remembered the 100,000 knights slaughtered in a mere 3 days, their armor as useless as paper against the relentless Mongol arrows. They remembered cities where the only survivors were the cats, because even the rats had been devoured by starving refugees. But in 1259, when the Golden Horde returned to Poland, expecting another easy feast of conquest, they encountered something entirely new, something they'd never faced before, an enemy that had learned from its own nightmares. The Mongols were about to discover the devastating consequences of teaching peaceful farmers how to become monsters. They had, in effect, created their own executioners. The entire Mongol war machine depended utterly on their horses. Each warrior traveled with a string of 5 to 10 mounts, rotating them to maintain speed and endurance. They drank their horses' blood for sustenance, used their hides for armor, and their bones for arrows. A Mongol without his horses wasn't a warrior. He was just a man in fur clothing, stranded far from home. The Poles, under the leadership of Duke Bolesław the Chaste, a name that would soon become ironic, considering what he was about to inflict upon Mongol prisoners, had spent 2 decades studying their enemy's greatest vulnerability. 3 months before the invasion, Polish forces initiated the most extensive scorched earth campaign in medieval history, poisoning wells with rotting corpses, burning every blade of grass for 50 miles, and salting grazing lands with lime and arsenic. Most diabolically, they left behind gift horses, beautiful Polish mares deliberately infected with glanders, a disease that spread through horse populations like wildfire, causing grotesque, pus-filled abscesses in the lungs, until the animals effectively drowned in their own fluids. When Mongol General Nogai Khan crossed the Vistula River in December of 1259 with 30,000 riders, his scouts reported something deeply unsettling. The land ahead was dead. Not conquered, not abandoned, but utterly and irrevocably dead. Every village was deserted. Every field was reduced to black ash. Every well was contaminated with the bloated corpses of horses. The Polish population had vanished like smoke, taking every last grain of wheat with them. They had even dug up their graveyards, removing the bones to deny the Mongols the possibility of grinding skeletal remains for calcium. By the 2nd week, the effects of the gift horses began to manifest. Mongol horses started coughing up blood, their necks swelling with grotesque abscesses that ruptured and spread infection through contact. The Mongols, lacking any understanding of disease transmission, moved the sick horses to the rear, alongside their healthy reserves, unwittingly spreading glanders throughout their entire herd. Within 3 weeks, horses were dying by the hundreds every day, their bodies left behind in a trail of death that wolves followed like a moving feast. Then the Polish ghosts began their work. Duke Bolesław had recruited not knights but peasants, men who knew the forests intimately, who could move silently in the dead of winter, and who had spent the past 20 years consumed by dreams of vengeance for their murdered families. These weren't soldiers, they were hunters, and they'd been given simple, brutal instructions. Kill Mongols like you would kill wolves. No honor, no mercy, just death. The tactics they employed were devastating in their simplicity. Polish raiders would wait for Mongol scouting parties to make camp, then attack during the deepest hours of sleep, just before dawn. But they didn't engage in pitched battles, they simply slit the throats of the horses and vanished back into the forest. A Mongol warrior might wake to find all 5 of his horses dead, their blood turning the snow into a crimson slush, with no enemy in sight. Without horses, stranded in enemy territory in the dead of winter, he was already as good as dead. It just took a few days of walking through the frozen forests for him to fully realize it. One Mongol unit of 500 men awoke to discover that the throat of every single one of their horses had been cut. The animals were arranged in a circle around their camp like a grotesque warning. The Poles had carried out the task so silently that not even the sentries had noticed. The message was crystal clear. We can kill you whenever we want. The psychological impact was devastating. Mongol warriors, who had conquered everything from China to Hungary, now found themselves afraid to sleep. They knew that Mongols traveled light, depending on raiding and foraging for supplies. So the Poles began leaving abandoned supply caches, barrels of mead, sacks of grain, preserved meats, all poisoned with hemlock and wolfsbane, but not enough to kill immediately, just enough to cause agonizing stomach cramps and bloody diarrhea. One Mongol captain, Baydar, wrote in his dispatch to Nogai Khan, "The enemy is nowhere and everywhere. We conquer empty villages and rule over ghosts. My men defecate blood and see demons. The horses eat each other's manes from hunger. This land is cursed." By January of 1260, the situation had become utterly desperate. Mongol horses, those that had managed to survive the disease, were eating the bark from trees, their own dung, and eventually each other. Warriors who had once drunk mare's milk and horse blood now watched helplessly as their mounts collapsed from starvation, too weak even to be slaughtered for meat. The Polish strategy was working perfectly. They had transformed Poland into a desert that consumed armies. Then came Sandomierz, where the trap finally snapped shut. Duke Bolesław had been retreating for weeks, always just out of reach, leaving a trail of poisoned supplies and dead land behind him. The Mongols, now reduced to perhaps 15,000 effective warriors from their original 30,000, pursued him towards Sandomierz on the Vistula River. They believed they had him cornered. They were tragically wrong. The Duke had spent 2 months preparing something special, a killing field designed specifically for Mongols. The Battle of Sandomierz was not a battle at all. It was a slaughter disguised as a battle. The Mongols approached the city to find the Polish army drawn up in traditional formation, knights in front, infantry behind, banners flying. It looked like the kind of formal European battle that the Mongols had crushed hundreds of times before. Nogai Khan ordered his traditional tactics, a feigned retreat to draw the knights out, then a shower of arrows to decimate them. But when the Mongol light cavalry began their feigned retreat, something unprecedented occurred. The Polish knights didn't follow. They simply stood their ground, shields raised, waiting. The Mongols wheeled around for their arrow assault and discovered the reason why. Their horses, already weakened by disease and starvation, couldn't gallop through the deep trenches hidden beneath a thin layer of snow and branches. Horses broke their legs by the dozens, throwing their riders into concealed pits filled with sharpened stakes smeared with human feces, ensuring that any wound would become septic. The trap had been perfectly designed to counter every single Mongol advantage. As the Mongol cavalry floundered in the trap field, Polish crossbowmen emerged from concealed positions. But they weren't aiming at the warriors. They were systematically shooting the horses. Every single horse, methodically and efficiently, like farmers culling diseased cattle. The Mongols, watching their mounts die, realized that they were now infantry in enemy territory in the dead of winter, hundreds of miles from any hope of support. Then the peasants arrived, thousands of them, armed not with swords but with farming implements. Flails for grain, hooks for hay, hammers for horseshoes. They had been promised something extraordinary by Duke Bolesław: 1 silver penny for every Mongol ear, 2 pennies for a thumb, and a gold ducat for a Mongol commander's head. What followed was less a combat engagement and more of a harvest. The Mongol warriors, trained from childhood for mounted warfare, tried to form defensive circles on foot. But they were exhausted, many still suffering from the effects of poisoning, and wearing armor designed for horseback, not ground combat. The peasants swarmed them like ants on dying beetles. They used harvest scythes to cut tendons, grain flails to crush skulls, and pruning hooks to drag warriors down into the mud, where they could be finished off with hammers and stones. One Polish chronicler described it: "The Tartars died not like warriors, but like sheep in slaughter season." Our peasants worked in teams, turning killing into a craft, like threshing wheat. The ear harvest, as it became known, lasted 3 hours. Some peasants, being practical, cut off both ears, despite the single payment rule, figuring they could sell the extra ones to less successful hunters. Others collected Mongol fingers to make necklaces that they would sell to merchants as protection charms. The Mongol commanders, easily identified by their silk undershirts and gold ornaments, were kept alive briefly, just long enough for the peasants to negotiate who got to claim the head bounty. Then they were beheaded with the same axes used to slaughter pigs, their screams mingling with the peasants' work songs. It was the harvest they had waited 20 years for, and they sang while they reaped. Nogai Khan himself survived, but only because Duke Bolesław had something special planned for him. The Mongol general was stripped naked, painted with pig's blood, and forced to ride a donkey backward through 20 Polish villages while the peasants threw dung and rotten vegetables at him. In each village, the locals were allowed to cut off one small piece of him, a finger joint, a piece of ear, a toe, but not enough to kill him. By the time he reached the final village, he was missing numerous small parts and begging for death. Instead, they castrated him with sheep shears and sent him back to the Golden Horde as a message. This is what Europe does to invaders now. Meanwhile, at Kressenbrunn in Austria, King Ottokar II of Bohemia was conducting his own extermination campaign. The Battle of Kressenbrunn in July of 1260 was different from Sandomierz. This was a clash between heavily armored knights and Mongol cavalry in an open field. But the Bohemians had learned from 20 years of defeat. They had developed new tactics specifically designed to counter the Mongols. Instead of charging, they formed hollow squares bristling with pikes, like mobile fortresses. Swiss mercenaries with crossbows stood inside, creating kill zones that horses couldn't enter. When Mongol arrows bounced harmlessly off their improved plate armor, and when their cavalry charges impaled themselves on the pike walls, the Mongols realized that their traditional tactics were obsolete. The Bohemian heavy cavalry, held in reserve, waited until the Mongol horses were exhausted from futile charges. Then they attacked. These weren't the old-style knights who had been slaughtered at Legnica. These wore full-plate armor that Mongol arrows couldn't penetrate, rode massive destriers that trampled Mongol ponies, and wielded warhammers specifically designed to crush through Mongol lamella armor. The killing at Kressenbrunn was so thorough that Ottokar ordered his men to stop taking ears. There were simply too many to count. Instead, they just piled Mongol heads into pyramids along the main trade route from Vienna to Prague. Over 50 pyramid markers, each containing between 100 and 300 heads. But the most horrifying fate awaited the Mongol stragglers who fled into the Carpathian Mountains. Winter in the Carpathians is brutal, even with adequate supplies. The Mongol survivors, perhaps 3,000 men who had escaped the slaughters, found themselves trapped in mountain passes with no food, no horses, and temperatures dropping to -30 degrees. Polish and Hungarian mountain villages had been warned that they were coming. The villagers blocked the passes with fallen trees, destroyed bridges, and then waited. Starvation in the mountains follows a predictable pattern. First, the leather, belts, boots, saddles. Then, the frozen horse carcasses. Then, bark, pine needles, and finally, by week 4, each other. A Hungarian patrol found a Mongol camp where the occupants had clearly turned on each other. Bodies were butchered with the same precision the Mongols used on sheep. Major muscle groups were removed, bones were cracked for marrow, and even the skin was cooked into a sort of crackling. The survivors had established rules. The sick were eaten first, then the wounded, and then lots were drawn among the healthy. A Mongol warrior's journal, recovered from his frozen corpse, contained a chilling confession. "We ate Timur yesterday. He was my brother in arms for 6 years. His liver was diseased, black with spots. But we ate it anyway. Tomorrow they will share me. The mountains are full of demons that look like peasants." The mountain villages indeed watched and waited. When Mongol groups became weak enough, peasants would attack with hunting bows and boar spears. But mostly, they just waited for winter to do their work. They would find frozen Mongols in the spring, perfectly preserved, their faces twisted in expressions of final agony. The bodies were stripped of anything valuable. Weapons, armor, gold, dental work, and left for the wolves. Some villages developed a gruesome economy around Mongol corpses. They harvested tendons for bowstrings, hair for brushes, and skulls for drinking cups. A bitter reversal of what the Mongols had done to the Europeans at Legnica. Every household had Mongol skull bowls used specifically for feast days. The few hundred Mongols who made it through the mountains faced a final horror: the slave markets. The Venetians, always pragmatic about profit, had established a robust trade in Mongol prisoners. But these weren't warriors anymore. They were broken, starving, and often mutilated survivors who had eaten human flesh to survive. The Venetians bought them for almost nothing from Hungarian peasants, then sold them to Egyptian Mamluks, who found ironic satisfaction in enslaving the sons of the men who had enslaved half the world. The slave ships were floating hells, packed into holds designed for cargo, chained to prevent suicide, and fed just enough to keep them alive until they reached sail. Many went mad from the reversal of fortune. Children received different treatment. Mongol boys under the age of 10 were castrated and sold as eunuchs to guard harems. The survival rate from the crude castration was perhaps 1 in 3. Those who survived were trained to forget they were ever Mongol, raised to serve in the palaces of the very civilizations their fathers had tried to destroy. Mongol girls were sold to brothels across the Mediterranean, marketed specifically as the daughters of the conquerors for clients who took sadistic pleasure in dominating the offspring of feared warriors. The Venetian merchant Marco Sanudo recorded, "The Tartars make poor slaves. They refuse to work. They attack their overseers with their teeth like wild dogs, and many hang themselves with their own chains." Back in Poland, Duke Bolesław ordered a special monument to be built from Mongol bones. At the site of Sandomierz, Polish peasants constructed a church. Its foundation mortar was mixed with ground Mongol bones. Its walls were decorated with Mongol skulls arranged in crosses. Its altar was made from a single block of stone where Nogai Khan had been castrated. They called it the Church of Divine Vengeance. It stood for 200 years until it was destroyed by embarrassed church officials who deemed it un-Christian. The immediate military impact was decisive. The Mongol invasion force of 30,000 had been essentially exterminated. Perhaps 500 made it back to the Golden Horde, many missing ears, fingers, or other body parts, telling tales of poisoned earth and enemies who fought without honor. But Europe wasn't done teaching lessons. When news of the victories reached other European courts, it triggered what historians call the Mongol Hunt of 1261 to 1263. Suddenly, every minor lord wanted Mongol heads for their castle walls. Bounty hunters specialized in tracking down Mongol stragglers. The Teutonic Knights sent cleansing parties deep into Eastern Europe to find and exterminate any remaining Mongol camps. These hunts were exercises in creative brutality. The Teutonic Knights would capture Mongol scouts, force them to reveal their camp locations, then use the scouts as living torches, covering them in pitch and setting them ablaze before sending them running back into their own camps. The Hungarian Baron Bela preferred impalement, lining his borders with Mongol warriors on stakes. The Golden Horde made one last attempt at retaliation in 1262. A force of 10,000 riders was sent to raid Poland as punishment. They made it exactly 30 miles past the border before discovering that Polish peasants had developed an early warning system using church bells. Within hours, every village for 50 miles knew that the Mongols were coming. The earth was scorched ahead of them. Wells were poisoned, and Polish wolf packs of mounted peasants shadowed them constantly. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers who had learned to fight like Mongols, adopting their hit-and-run tactics, but with crucial knowledge of the land. They would strike at night, kill sentries, steal horses, poison supplies, then vanish into forests the Mongols didn't know. The Mongol commander Bundai reported, "We are not fighting an army, but the land itself. Every tree hides an archer. Every stream is poisoned. Every village is empty but watching. My men are afraid to sleep, afraid to eat, afraid to drink water. This is not war, it is being slowly digested by a hostile country." After 2 weeks of this psychological torture, the Mongols retreated. As they withdrew, Polish peasants followed, picking off stragglers. The final insult came at the border. Polish children, some as young as 7, stood on hills throwing rocks at the retreating Mongol army while singing mocking songs about the brave horsemen who ran from farmers. The Mongols, who had conquered the greatest empires on earth, were being laughed at by children. The Golden Horde never attempted another serious invasion of Central Europe. The transformation was complete. In 1241, Europe had trembled before Mongol horsemen like sheep before wolves. By 1263, European peasants were wearing necklaces of Mongol finger bones and drinking from Mongol skulls, while their children played games called Hunt the Tartar with the captured helmets of dead warriors. The invincible had become the hunted. The conquerors had become commodities in slave markets. And the terror of the steppes had learned to fear the sound of Christian church bells. The myth of Mongol invincibility was dead, killed by farmers with pitchforks who had learned that the secret to defeating monsters was to become something worse. Stories filtered back along the Silk Road, the great Mongol warriors defeated by European farmers, their generals castrated like sheep, their children sold in markets, their bones ground into mortar for churches. Other peoples who had submitted to Mongol rule began to wonder. If Polish peasants could destroy the invincible Mongol army with poisoned wells and farming tools, what were they so afraid of? Within a generation, the Mongol Empire began its long fragmentation. The Yuan dynasty in China would fall, the Ilkhanate in Persia would collapse, the Golden Horde would shrink and divide. The spell was broken when Polish peasants proved that the invincible warriors were just men who could be killed with pitchforks. Today, archaeologists still find mass graves along the Carpathian mountain passes. Mongol warriors who died from starvation and cold, their bones bearing teeth marks indicating cannibalism. In Polish museums, you can see the preserved harvest tools, the modified scythes and flails specifically designed for killing dismounted Mongols, passed down through families as heirlooms. Some rural Polish churches still have foundation stones that, when tested, contain unusual amounts of human calcium. The ground bones of Mongol warriors mixed into the mortar. The Mongols called their empire the eternal blue sky, but they discovered that even the eternal sky ends at the edge of a Polish peasant's scythe. They taught Europe how to be monsters, and Europe had learned the lesson all too well. The last Mongol to leave Poland alive in 1263 was a young scout named Kutul, who had lost his ears, nose, and fingers to Polish peasants. He made it back to the Golden Horde and lived another 40 years, warning every young warrior about the land of death, where the earth itself was poisoned and farmers wore necklaces of Mongol bones. He ended every warning the same way. They say we were invincible. We were not. We were just men far from home who learned that teaching sheep to be wolves means one day the sheep will eat you. He was right. The Mongols had created their own executioners. They really should have stayed on the steppes where they belonged, instead of teaching peaceful farmers the art of systematic slaughter.